students, I hope all of you are doing fine and I welcome you to yet another session of biology. In today's session, we'll be covering two chapters. We'll be covering heredity and evolution as well as our environment. So let's have a look at some of the important topics that are present in this chapter. So if we talk about heredity and evolution, Mendel's law is extremely important. Apart from that, the types of traits, right, which means inherited as well as acquired traits. Apart from that, monohybrid and dihybrid cross. So monohybrid and dihybrid cross, you should be aware of the crosses, how they are made, and basically what type of phenotypic and genotypic ratios do we expect to see in a monohybrid cross as well as a dihybrid cross. So that is important. And then sex determination. If we talk about our environment, then these are the following topics which which are important. Everything is important, as I've been continuously saying from the beginning, but a little stress should be given to these topics. A little more stress should be given to these topics. So first is decomposition, how it is important for maintaining a balance in our ecosystem basically. Trophic levels, food chain, food webs, how these things are interconnected with each other. Then the flow of energy that takes place from one trophic level to another. The different types of waste and how do we manage those waste, how do we dispose them of. And lastly, ozone depletion, causes and concerns. What is ozone, why is it important, and what harmful effects we would have to face if the ozone layer were to be depleted completely. So all these things are important. So let's have a look at the first question, first MCQ question. The first MCQ question says that a detritus food chain begins with, and our options are carnivores, herbivores, omnivores and decomposers. So we are well aware of the fact that a detritus food chain is nothing but decomposition, right? And decomposition is going to start obviously with decomposers. So decomposers is the correct option here. So a detritus food chain begins with decomposers. Let's have a look at the next question. In food web, flow of energy is. So we know this by now that flow of energy is strictly unidirectional. It cannot be reversed, or it is not possible to bring it in reverse direction. It is always a unidirectional process that takes place. So our answer should be that flow of energy is unidirectional. So let's have a look at the options. Non-directional, bidirectional, unidirectional and none of the above. So flow of energy is always unidirectional and cannot be reversed. Okay, it cannot be reversed. Next, which of the following is not an example of abiotic factors? Not an example of abiotic factors. So we know that there are two types of factors that are present in an environment. Biotic factors, which include all the living organism, and abiotic factors that comprise the non-living, right? So we have to select which one is not an abiotic factor, which one is not a non-living factor. So out of all these options, water, plants, heat and temperature, we know that plants, they come under biotic factors. These are living. So answer will be B, plants is not an abiotic factor, right? Let's move to the next question. A genetic constitution of an organism is called genotype, phenotype, variation and none of the above. So let's look at the options. Variations are the differences that are present between organisms, or that take place as as evolution takes place. The differences that occur in a species, they are known as variation. So variation is not our answer. Phenotype refers to the external features, or let's say external or morphological features. Externally, what do we see? It has nothing to do with the internal configuration, whereas genotype is the genetic constitution of an organism, right? So our correct answer here should be the genetic constitution of an organism is known as its genotype. So answer A, genotype, is the correct answer here. Next, 2-marker question. Differentiate between biodegradable and non-biodegradable substances and give one example of each, right? So we know that biodegradable substances are those substances that can be easily broken down into simpler substances by the action of various microorganisms, and because they can be broken down, they do not get accumulated, hence they do not lead to, or they do not contribute much in the pollution if we talk about that. But non-biodegradable waste, they cannot be broken down into microorganisms, they cannot be broken down into simpler substances by the action of microorganisms, and hence as a result of it, what will happen, they will keep on accumulating, and at one point they will become toxic, and they will contribute to the pollution that is happening around us. So let's have a look at it. Biodegradable substances consists of the waste materials which can be broken down into harmless substances in nature in due course of time इनको भी लगेगा break down करने में, but after some time they will be broken down by the action of microorganisms. So by the action of microorganisms such as certain bacteria, they are known as biodegradable waste. For example, cattle dung, wool, paper, compost, etc. will come under biodegradable waste. Sooner or later in a natural course of time, they will be broken down into harmless substances, and therefore they will not contribute to pollution. Non-biodegradable waste materials which cannot be broken down into harmless substances by the action of microorganisms are called non-biodegradable waste. Example, plastic, polythene bags, metal articles, etc. So I can also say that biodegradable waste, they will not cause much pollution, whereas non-biodegradable waste can lead to pollution because they get accumulated and it is very difficult or almost impossible to break them down. Okay, so this point also can be added. Next, write a difference between inherited traits and acquired traits, giving one example each. Inherited traits are traits that an organism can inherit from their parents, that can be passed through the generation from the parent to the progeny because they are inculcated in the DNA of the organism. These traits or these changes or these characteristics are present at the very grassroots level of the DNA, right? Whereas acquired traits are traits that an organism acquires within their lifetime, within their lifespan, but these are not inculcated at the genetic level. These are not incorporated at the genetic level. So inherited traits are incorporated at genetic level, and that is why they can be inherited through the generation. They can be passed on from one generation to another. So let's have a look at the answer. A trait or characteristic of an organism which is not inherited but develops in response to the environment is called acquired trait. For example, if a group of mice are normally bred, all their progeny will have tails. Now, if the tails of these mice are cut by surgery in each generation, tailless mice will not be produced. This is because removal of tail is an acquired characteristic. If you are cutting the tail of a mice, that change is not incorporated in the genetic level. That change is not incorporated at the DNA level. So no matter till how many generations you cut the tail of the mice, the further generation will not be tailless, because this is a change that they have acquired. This is a change that has not been inculcated at the DNA level, so it will not be passed on from one generation to another. Let's have a look at inherited traits. A trait or a characteristic of an organism which is caused by a change in its genes or DNA is called an inherited trait. Inherited traits can be passed on to the progeny of the organisms because they have produced changes in the genes. Changes in genes can be passed on. Changes in genes can be passed on, and so inherited traits can be passed on from parent to progeny. For example, skin color in human beings is an inherited trait. Alright, let's move to the next question. Why do producers always occupy the first trophic level in every food chain? This is the first part of the question. Second part, which of the following are at the second trophic level of the food chain? Carnivores, autotrophs and herbivores. So firstly, it is important for us to understand what a trophic level is. So trophic level is basically a place or a position that each organism occupies in a particular ecosystem, right? So the first trophic level will obviously be the green plants. They are the producers. Why do they occupy the first level? They occupy the first level, or rather producer can be any organism which is capable of synthesizing its own food, right? So producers such as green plants, they occupy the first trophic level because they do not depend on any other organism for food. They can synthesize their own food, right? They can produce their own food. Rather, other organisms depend on them for food, right? So energy will start passing on from this level, right? This is the level from which food will be synthesized without any dependency on other organisms. So that is why producers occupy the first trophic level in every food chain, because basically they are producing food, right? So producers are the green plants that can manufacture food using carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight, which means that they are autotrophs. They serve as a source of food for all the non-producers or consumers. So now all the other trophic levels are directly or indirectly dependent on these producers, right? Directly or indirectly, all the other trophic levels are now dependent on these producers. That is why they occupy the first trophic level. So they serve as a source of food for all non-producers or consumers directly or indirectly. Hence, producers occupy the first trophic level in a food chain. Next question, which of the following is at the second trophic level? So first trophic level is producers, which means let's say plants. Second trophic level will be occupied by organisms that directly consume plants, that directly eat plants. And organisms that eat plants are known as herbivores. So the second trophic level will be occupied by herbivores. Right? So herbivores occupy the second trophic level of food chain, right? Moving on to 3-marker questions now. The first question, so basically it has 2 parts. So let's go through each of the parts. The first part says, explain how pesticides enter a food chain and subsequently get into our body. And secondly, name 2 components of an ecosystem, also give examples of each. So first question says that how do pesticides get inside a food chain and subsequently they enter the body of an organism. So basically pesticides are chemicals that are sprayed on plants or on crops for protection purposes, but what happens, these pesticides can go or they can seep into the soil. right? Once they seep into the soil, they can be taken up by the plants that are growing in that soil. They can be taken up by the crops that are growing in that soil, and they can enter the system of the crops that are growing in that soil. And being non-biodegradable, they do not get decomposed very easily. It is not easy to degrade them. So being non-biodegradable, they enter the plants, and then plants act as producers. So if some other organism is now eating those plants, these pesticides through the plants are now going to enter into the body of the organism that consumes those plants, right? Because plants, everyone is dependent on plants directly or indirectly, right? So now even if we wash the crops, or even if we wash the plants before consuming, but externally, okay, we can get rid of whatever extra pesticide is attached to it, but through the soil, via the roots, the pesticides has entered inside the plant as well. So we will never be able to get rid of these pesticides 100%, right? So that is the problem, and that is how pesticides, they actually enter through the food chain, they enter into the body of an organism. So pesticides used for crop production, when washed away, go down into the soil. These pesticides are absorbed by plants, which are the producers. On consumption of these plants, the pesticides enter our food chain, and being non-biodegradable, these chemicals get accumulated progressively and enter our body. Next question, name two components of an ecosystem, also give examples of each. The two main components of an ecosystem are biotic component, which forms the living component, and abiotic component, which forms the non-living component. And examples of biotic components are plants and animals, and abiotic components can be water, temperature, etc. Okay? Next, list two reasons to show that existence of decomposers is essential in an ecosystem. State the possible consequences of elimination of decomposers from earth. So decomposers are important because if or in absence of decomposition or decomposers, waste would keep on getting accumulated without actually being broken down into simpler substances, right? There would be accumulation of a lot of waste without it actually being broken down, right? Second thing that would happen, that the cycle that runs, the nutrient cycle that runs, that would also not take place, right? So the existence of decomposers in an ecosystem is essential, because if there were no decomposers, then the dead bodies of plants and animals would get accumulated, and the elements constituting plant and animal bodies would never be returned to their original pool like soil. If the bodies or if the wastes are not broken down, then the let's say minerals that are present or the compounds that are present inside the body of that organism, they will never be returned to the soil, and hence this cycle, nutrient cycle, would fail to exist. So the elements constituting plant and animal bodies would never be returned to their original pools like soil or water. So in such case, the organic waste would go on accumulating, and the cyclic process of life and death would be disrupted. What all are the consequences that would take place if decomposers were to get eliminated from earth? So consequences would be, first, there would be no recycling of nutrients, and therefore raw materials to produce food will not be available for the producers. Hence the food chain will get affected. If there are no nutrients, then what will be available to the plants? Nothing. And if plants are not able to synthesize their food, then subsequently there will be no food chain that was to exist. Secondly, the dead bodies of plants and animals would keep on accumulating, and that would cause severe pollution in the environment, right? So these are the two consequences that one could face if decomposers were to be eliminated from Earth. Next, name the plant that Mendel used for his experiment. What type of progeny was obtained by Mendel in F1 and F2 generations when he crossed the tall and short plants? Write the ratio he obtained in the F1 and F2 generation. So Mendel selected pea plant Pisum sativum for his hybridization experiments, and he first selected pure line plants. So pure line plants means that the tall plant had a pure gene, capital T, and the dwarf plant or the short plant had the gene small t, right? So what he observed was that when he crossed the tall plant and the dwarf plant, so this is the parent progeny, he obtained the progeny to be tall, right? This represents the fact that tallness is a dominant trait, and it immediately gets expressed in the first generation or the first filial generation, and dwarfness being the recessive trait, it becomes masked by the dominant trait, or we can say that it does not immediately express itself in the F1 generation, right? So in the F1 generation, he observed that only one of the two contrasting characters appeared. Which one? Tallness, and he called this character as dominant, and the one which does not get expressed in F1 was called as recessive. He later selfed the F1 plant. So now F1 plant, so capital T were selfed, and the next generation that we obtained contained 3 tall and 1 dwarf plant, which leads to the conclusion that A, recessive characters do not disappear. They may get masked in the first generation, but eventually they will get expressed. Eventually they will show their presence. So it's not that recessive characteristics completely disappear. They may get masked by the dominant characters, but somewhere or someplace or the other they will express themselves, right? Also, 3 tall plants were obtained and 1 dwarf plant was obtained. So by looking at the plants, we can say that yes, we have 3 tall and 1 dwarf plant, which means that externally, if we look at the plant, 3 of them are tall, 1 of them is dwarf. Phenotypic ratio determines the external morphology. So the phenotypic ratio for tall is to dwarf is 3:1. But if we look at the genetic constitution, if we look at the genotypic ratio, we see that one of them is homozygous tall, 2 are heterozygous tall, and 1 is homozygous dwarf, right? So genetic constitution is not the same. One of them is capital T, 2 capital T, small t, and 1 small t. So the phenotypic ratio at the end of this particular experiment, the phenotypic ratio that was obtained in the F2 generation was 3:1. But if we look at the genotypic ratio, the genetic constitution, then the genetic constitution was 1:2:1. So in such a case that involves monohybrid or dihybrid questions, you have to draw a cross in this way, and then you have to explain everything. Don't just write down the theory and not explain the cross. It is very, very important that whenever a question is asked about a monohybrid or a dihybrid cross, you actually draw and explain the cross, right? Okay, so now let's have a look at the 5-marker question. The 5-marker question says that it is a matter of chance whether a couple will have a male or a female child. Justify the statement by drawing a flow chart. Let's have a look at the answer. Sex is determined at the time of fertilization when male and female gametes fuse. Male produces 2 types of gametes, X or Y. So male produces 2 types of gametes, having the chromosomes X or Y, and female produces the same type of gametes having the chromosomes X and X. So it basically the sex of the child is basically determined, or male partner is responsible for the sex of the child because female is producing the same type of gametes. It is the male which is producing the different type of gametes. So the sex of the child is determined at the time of fertilization when male and female gametes, they fuse to form a zygote. Now, if a sperm carrying X chromosome fertilizes with an egg carrying X chromosome, then it would result into the offspring being a girl, right? This is because the offspring is going to have XX combination of sex chromosome. But if the sperm carrying Y chromosome fertilizes with the ovum carrying X chromosome, then the sex or the gender of the baby would be a boy or a male, right? This is because the offspring is going to have XY combination of sex chromosomes. Therefore, there will be a 50% chance that a male child is born and 50% chance that a female child is born, and it depends on the male partner because it is the male partner that produces two different types of gametes. The female partner is producing the same type of gametes, so it doesn't matter. But if the male partner, it depends on the male partner, if the X from the male fuses with the X from the female, then we get a girl. If the Y from the male fuses with the X from the female, then we get a boy. So this is how you will be able to answer this particular question. Moving on, okay, now this question consists of four parts. So let's have a look. Let's answer these questions part-wise. A. Construct a terrestrial food chain comprising of 4 trophic levels. So you have to construct a terrestrial food chain that comprises of 4 trophic levels. So a terrestrial food chain with 4 trophic levels can be grass, insect, frog, and eagle. Next, what will happen if we kill all organisms in one trophic level? Removal of organisms of any trophic level will always adversely affect the ecosystem, right? Example, removal of lions and tigers, which are the top carnivores, will cause rapid increase in the deer population. If we eradicate top carnivores, then there will be an increase in the population of organisms like deer, right? So it will cause rapid increase in deer population, which will lead to rapid consumption of vegetation. Now, more is the population of deer, more vegetation they would eat, right? So it will result into decline of the crops, or let's say the plants or the producers, resulting in scarcity of vegetation. And eventually, when there is a scarcity in vegetation, then deers will have nothing to eat and their population will also decline. So in a way, what we are trying to say here is that removing any trophic level can create an imbalance in the ecosystem, because all organisms present on every trophic level are interdependent on each other in some or the other way. Therefore, removal or reduction in any organism of any trophic level will directly or indirectly affect other trophic levels as well. Okay. Next, calculate the amount of energy available to the organism at the 4th trophic level if the energy available to the organism at the 2nd trophic level is 2000 joules. So at the 2nd trophic level, the energy is 2000 joules, and we know that only 10% of energy will be passed on to the successive trophic levels because of the 10% law of energy. So it means that if the energy at the second trophic level is 2000, at the first trophic level it would have been 20,000. At the third trophic level it will be 200, and at the fourth trophic level it is going to be 20. So 20,000, then 2000, then 200, then 20. So if the energy that is provided to us at the second trophic level is 2000 joules, then the energy that will be present at the fourth trophic level will be 20 joules. So 20 joules of energy will be present at the fourth trophic level. Last question. Why should biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste be discarded in two separate dustbins? Simply because of the reason that biodegradable waste can be decomposed by the action of microorganisms, and non-biodegradable waste cannot be broken down by such mechanisms. So it is better for us to segregate these wastes into different dustbins. So biodegradable wastes are decomposed naturally by the action of microbes, which degrade them to their simple constituents, enabling their nutrition to recycle amongst the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So as decomposition takes place, as degradation takes place, the nutrients will be able to recycle amongst all these biotic and abiotic components. However, non-biodegradable waste cannot be disposed of naturally, since they cannot be decomposed by microbes. So they should either be recycled or incinerated or put in landfills. So such wastes are either recycled, incinerated means burning off, or put in landfills. As disposal methods of two types of waste is different, it is advisable to discard these two types of waste in separate dustbins, because the disposal method is different, the course of action for their disposal is different. So that is why biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste should be discarded or should be disposed of in different dustbins. Next, assertion and reason questions. So again we have 4 options. First option says both assertion and reason are true, and reason is the correct explanation of assertion. Option B, both assertion and reason are true, but reason is not the correct explanation for assertion. Option C, assertion is true but reason is false. Option D, assertion is false and reason is true. Let's have a look at the first set of statements. Assertion: polythene bags and plastic containers are non-biodegradable substances. This statement is absolutely true. Reason: they can be broken down by microorganisms in natural, simple, harmless substances. This statement is false, because since we have already established that they are non-biodegradable substances, which means that they cannot be broken down by microorganisms. So assertion is true but reason is false. So the option that we choose is option C. Next, a geneticist crossed 2 pea plants and got 50% tall and 50% dwarf in the progeny, right? Reason: one plant was heterozygous tall and the other was dwarf. So let's have a look. Let's backtrack the question. Reason is saying that one plant was heterozygous tall and the other was dwarf. So this is the heterozygous tall plant, and this is the only situation where the plant is going to be a dwarf. So what will happen? So this is capital T small t, capital T small t, small t small t, and small t small t. So 50% of the generation is tall and 50% of the generation is dwarf, right? And that is what is written in the assertion, that he got 50% tall and 50% dwarf in the progeny, because one of the plant was heterozygous tall and the other plant was dwarf. So that is why the progeny that he got was 50% tall and 50% dwarf, right? So this Both these statements are correct, and reason is the correct explanation for assertion. So the option that we are going to choose here is option A. Let's have a look at the next statement. Assertion says mutation is sudden change in the genetic material. This is true. Reason, variation is useful for the survival of species over time. This is also true. So both the statements are true, but they are not interconnected, and the reason is not explaining the assertion. It does not give an explanation to the assertion. These are two independent statements. Both of them are correct, but these are two independent statements. So we'll choose answer B, that both assertion and reason are correct, but reason is not the correct explanation for assertion. These are two independent statements that are given. Let's have a look at the fourth statement. Assertion says pea plant is considered ideal for hybridization experiments. It is true. Reason, pea is self-pollinating plant which has a short life cycle and bears visible contrasting characteristics. This is also true, and this actually explains why pea plant is considered ideal for hybridization experiments, right? This sentence actually explains why pea plant was used in hybridization experiments. So both assertion and reason are correct, and reason is the correct explanation for assertion. So we are going to choose the option A. Let's have a look at the case study question. We are an integral part of the environment. Changes in the environment affect us, and our activities change the environment around us. Ozone is a molecule formed by 3 atoms of oxygen. While O2, which we normally refer to as oxygen, is essential for all aerobic forms of life, ozone is a deadly poison. However, at higher levels of atmosphere, ozone performs an essential function. It shields the surface of Earth from UV radiation from the sun. First question, how is ozone formed? The UV radiations coming from the sun split molecular oxygen into nascent oxygen. When these nascent oxygen combine with molecular oxygen, they form ozone. So the UV radiations, they split the molecular oxygen into nascent oxygen, and when this nascent oxygen, it combines with oxygen, molecular oxygen, ozone is formed. So UV radiations coming from the sun split molecular oxygen into nascent oxygen. When these nascent oxygen combine with molecular oxygen, then ozone is formed. Next question, in which layer of atmosphere does ozone is present in? So ozone is present in the stratosphere layer of the atmosphere. We are all aware of this, that ozone is present in the stratosphere layer of the atmosphere. Next, what are the causes for ozone depletion? So CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that were used basically as refrigerants and as coolants basically, and in fire extinguishers, they were chemicals that led to the depletion of this particular ozone layer, right? So the synthetic chemicals like CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were used as refrigerants and in fire extinguishers, they were responsible for the depletion of this ozone layer. Next, it says write the chemical equation for the formation of ozone. Write the chemical equation for formation of ozone. Right, so the chemical equation, as we previously also saw, oxygen in the presence of UV breaks into nascent oxygen. This nascent oxygen, upon combining with molecular oxygen, gives us the ozone. Lastly, what are the harmful effects of UV radiations? UV radiations can cause skin diseases like premature aging and skin cancer, and it can also cause eye diseases such as cataract, and not only that, it can also cause damage to DNA. So UV can actually cause damage at the very genetic level as well, right? So that is all for today's session. In today's session, we basically covered the following topics from heredity and evolution, Mendel's experiment, sex determination, types of trait, from our environment, decomposition, ozone, energy flow, food chain, and trophic levels. So that is all for today's session. Thank you very much and all the best.